It is January 18th, 2019. Today I wanted to address the persistent mythology that carbohydrates are the primary driver of risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And you may have seen one of my other videos where I looked at the Seven-Day Adventist study, a study of 90,000 people examined over about a decade-long time period. And from those findings, you could see that the risk of vegans getting type 2 diabetes was far, far lower than that of the omnivores who ate meat, eggs, dairy, fish, and all kinds of animal products. But this is a different type of study. This is from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and this was done in a clinical setting. What they did was they found a few dozen healthy volunteers, and these are people who did not have diabetes, and they had them consume different foods, and they measured their glucose response and their insulin response after consuming these various foods. And just a little primer on the terminology: glucose is just the blood sugar, and insulin is the hormone which one of its primary purposes is to signal the muscle cells to take in the blood sugar instead of allowing it to just circulate around in your bloodstream. So the findings, so they did, I don't know, they looked at probably a few different foods and measured this all out. And let's look at what they came up with. Now, this is what this is the insulin response divided by the presence of glucose in the blood. And I'll give you a real world example here in a minute. But you can see here they have these different food items. Some are higher than others. And we go down here and wow, we get down to the fish and beef, and we see that there is a far greater insulin response from fish and beef as compared to some of these other things. It's really contrary to what a lot of people would expect. Now, this, like I mentioned, this is insulin response per unit of glucose in the blood. Okay, let's think through this real world example. Let's say you take a healthy individual and maybe their fasted glucose is around 80, and you feed them a meal that is very high in carbohydrates and maybe low in protein and fat. Let's say we give them brown rice and a whole bunch of raisins and fruit. And what you will see is that their glucose level will spike up quite a bit. It would probably go up in the range of 150 to 180. The fasted was 80, so it could easily double. And if the person is healthy, it'll spike up, but then it'll very quickly go back down as the glucose is absorbed into the muscle tissue. So this brief spike is actually not problematic. It's really what happens in healthy individuals. Now, if that's one scenario, if we were to do a second scenario where we substituted half of those high carbohydrate foods with beef, what would happen? Beef in and of itself does not produce as much of a glucose response. So if you were to do that, you might see the blood sugar, instead of going from 180 to 160, instead of going from 80 before the meal to 160 after, you might see it go to, 120. Certainly the glucose would increase from the fasted level if you ate a combination of half beef and half carbohydrates. And that might be kind of a realistic scenario in the real world. But even with that, so yeah, the glucose response might not be as much if you included the beef, but because beef has such a high impact on insulin response, you're still going to have a way higher insulin increase with the meal that includes beef compared to one that is just a strictly high carbohydrate meal. Now, the ending result might not be as dramatic as this appears at first. It might be maybe the beef in the real world is more like over in here. But anyway, I wanted to follow this up with a counterclaim made by a well-known writer and keto advocate named Nina Teicholz, and she's the writer of a best-selling book called My Big Fat Surprise. And I will show you what her piece of evidence was refuting this mountain of evidence that does implicate beef and other animal foods with diabetes risk. Here is the lone piece of exculpatory evidence presented by Nina concerning the risk of diabetes from red meat consumption. And we see here that in general, since about 1975, red meat consumption in the U.S. has been on the decline, while at the same time, diabetes incidence has increased markedly. This is a classic case of correlation not necessarily equaling causation. If we were to do another graph where we graph the sales of vinyl records from 1975 through 2015, similarly, we would probably see a marked decline in the sales of vinyl records. But that does not mean that our lack of vinyl record purchases is driving diabetes higher. So let's examine further some of the factors that play during this time period. What Nina does not point out is that meat consumption in total actually increased during the period. So people ate less red meat, but they ate a lot more chicken and fish. Well, guess what? Chicken and fish increase the risk of diabetes as well. So you just exchange one risk factor for another. And another big thing, which she did not point out, is that during this time period, Americans consumed far more calories in recent years versus 1975. So they're eating more calories. And of course, we know whatever Americans are eating is causing diabetes, and just eating more in general and gaining weight increases the risk of diabetes. It's also quite possible that people exercise less and less as we went through the last few decades. That would be another contributing factor. And finally, we do know that people have been eating out more and more, and they're probably eating more processed foods. They're not cooking at home like they used to. So these are the real explanations for why diabetes increased. So anyway, hopefully Nina can see this, and we'll see a response video from her. I kind of don't think that'll happen though.